Welcome back, Richard. It's once again
Morning again.
you, my friend.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this is part two
This
of
is part
our
two.
feature on anxiety.
It-
And the title, it began with the title by of an article by Wendy Suzuki. She's a neuroscientist at New York University, called Anxiety Evolved to Help Us. What Went Wrong? And
yeah.
so this her explanation of this. And we talked about this in an introductory way in part one.
Mhm.
And she explains anxiety from sort of an evolutionary standpoint and says, hey, folks, I know that anxiety is troublesome and it's considered a mental illness, and it's, we tend to want to get rid of anxiety, but she wants us to rethink our feelings, our opinions, our approach to anxiety, and see it not as a mental illness to get rid of, but as a message system.
Right.
That's what it was originally designed for. That's what it has evolved as a messaging system to
Mhm.
say something is wrong. You need to take some sort of action.
Right.
It's our body and our brain telling us something is amiss in your environment. Let's figure out what to do about it. So rather than avoiding anxiety, rather than muffling anxiety, rather than getting rid of anxiety, either with medication or with anti-anxiety strategies, she said, let's slow down and deal with anxiety as it was meant to be in our bodies. And
Right.
so she makes it very simple. She says, in the face of uncertainty, our brains will always go to negative.
Mhm.
Let's assume the worst. And the emotional structures of the brain will be activated, and you will start to move toward fight or flight.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, the thinking part of the brain, the part of the brain that tells you, no, this really isn't dangerous. It's not a dangerous animal. It's the neighbor's dog, and the neighbor's dog is okay. So you have two parts of the brain at work here. The problem is when anxiety increases, the thinking part of the brain shuts down, which is
Right.
exactly what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
This is especially true in teenagers, by the way. Teenagers always default to the emotional structures of the brain, and then the thinking part of the brain gets activated later. That will start to balance itself out as they reach their 20s. But teenagers in particular are prone to this.
Absolutely. And that's why we see so many of these behaviors and so many of these reactions, overreactions sometimes in teenagers, as compared to adults. But I think the other problem, as you said, you have the neurobiological problem, but I think that the other big problem that she mentions is the idea of negativity bias.
Right.
And we see things in a much more negative light at certain times.
Right. Mhm.
And our body is evolved to watch out for negativity. Our body is evolved to look out for dangers and any warning that could be present in our environment to let us know that we're not safe, or that we need to get to safety, or that, get ready to fight because here comes a bear or something. It's our brain is prepared or designed to look for negativity. It doesn't look for positivity because positivity is safe. So it's not
Yeah.
going to be on alert for that. It's going to be on alert for negative things. And so we're always going to be looking for that first.
That's right. We tend, this wonderful thing that we call the brain. Hey, the first thing the brain is going to do, it's going to keep you alive,
Right.
regardless of what you do or what you think you're doing. That's the first thing it's going to do, is keep you alive. It doesn't care what you're thinking.
Right.
Its job is to keep you alive, and that's what it's going to do. And so we have this wonderful balance between emotions and thinking that goes awry in the face of danger. And that danger might be something in our environment physically that we can see, like a feral animal, or it
Mhm.
might be something that just gets triggered inside of us for no apparent reason.
Right.
So anxiety has two sources. So with that in mind, that anxiety is a good thing, we then presented last week, we presented the first 3 of 6 steps that Carolyn Spring recommends in order to manage anxiety in this way, to obey it as an evolutionary process, as a necessary human emotion. How should we deal with it? And we presented the first 3 last week.
Yeah,
And just a quick review. The first step is you have to understand that anxiety is trying to keep us safe. It's part of our fear response. It's an alerting mechanism. It's not an enemy. It's an ally. It's telling us, anxiety tells us, for some reason, and I don't know what it is, but for some reason, you're not safe right now. So figure out what that is to make sure that you're safe.
absolutely.
Second thing she advises is plan your response.
Right.
All these body sensations that you get, increased heart rate and dry mouth and sweaty palms and shaking and labored breathing, that's your body gearing up for action.
Right.
And that's supposed to happen. But rather than heading right to panic, say, wow, something I have to lose control of myself, decide first of all whether the threat is real or not. If it's a real threat, your body, you're going to go into fight or flight and you're going to run.
Right.
But if it's not that kind of a dangerous threat, take a moment, pause, take a moment. Am I really in danger or not? Okay, that's the second step. And the third step is collaborate with our bodies. And we talked about how sleep, if you don't get enough sleep, if you get less than 6 hours of sleep, the emotional structures in your brain go on high alert. If you eat ultra processed foods, it increases anxiety. If you're not getting enough exercise, especially outdoor exercise, moving and walking and moving around in daylight, in sunlight, so you absorb the vitamin D. Avoid substances like caffeine and alcohol, because all that stuff increases anxiety. And so you have to take care of your body: sleep, diet, movement, your environment, avoiding substances, avoiding excessive use of substances. A little bit of caffeine is okay. A little bit of alcohol probably won't hurt you, but anything done to excess is going to make anxiety worse. And the last thing she talks about in step 3 is stop trying to avoid anxiety. Anxiety is it's a natural, normal human emotion that we're supposed to have. So don't do all these things just to muffle or avoid anxiety. Acknowledge it and use it to figure out what's wrong, and then deal with the root cause of what's causing the anxiety.
Absolutely. So those were the first 3 steps
Mm.
that she presents. And so today we're going to really focus a little bit more on steps 4, 5, and 6.
Right.
And so kind of given those first 3, the idea of, recognizing that anxiety is helpful, is important, planning your response and collaborating with your body, preparing. The fourth thing is a little bit more cognitive, and that
Right.
is avoid being anxious about being anxious.
Right.
And this is a great way to say, to avoid ruminating, to avoid this process that we do for some reason where we are anxious about being anxious. We're anxious about the anticipation of something that we dislike, or anxious about something that's not in our immediate environment. And I think that this is really where we start talking about, anxiety as a mental health concern, because when you're anxious about things that aren't really present,
Right.
anxious about things that aren't really going on right now, then that sort of starts to take us into a different realm of problem.
Mhm.
So when you avoid being anxious about being anxious, now again, we're starting to reframe and restructure some of the ways that we're thinking about things.
That's right. Yeah, and I like this, we talked about negativity bias.
Right.
These are the psychological things that you need to do. And so one is realized that, yes, you're going to have negativity bias. Second thing is you have to reframe how you think about anxiety. Anxiety is simply a message. It's not who you are.
Right.
We tend to think of, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm ADHD, I'm bipolar. No, you're not any of those things. It's particularly true for anxiety. Anxiety is simply a message. So rather than thinking of I have anxiety, of course you have anxiety. Every member of our species has anxiety. You're supposed to have anxiety. It's you're supposed to have other emotions, and you're supposed to have anxiety. And so anxiety, it's not, you don't have anxiety. Anxiety is not who you are. And yes, you're going to experience anxiety. You experience it, you don't have it. So you have to change the way you talk about this stuff. I experience anxiety. Yes, you do, and you're supposed to. Or my anxiety made me do it. No, it didn't. Your anxiety simply sent you a message, and then you have to deal with that. So anxiety is a notification.
Right.
So stop, notice it. Don't just react. Don't get frightened that you have anxiety. That's what she means. Don't be anxious about being anxious. Don't simply react to your anxiety. Think about what your anxiety is trying to tell you. We
Right.
don't need to panic, and we don't need to avoid it. So avoid those two extremes. You don't need to
Right.
panic because you're anxious, and you don't, and please don't try to avoid it because you
Right.
need to use it.
Right. And with this one, I think about the book about why zebras don't get ulcers,
Yeah.
right? Because they're not other animals, other mammals. They don't get anxious about things that aren't immediately happening. They don't get
Mhm.
anxious about the anticipation of something that could happen at some point in the future. So that's
Right.
why you can have a zebra and a lion drinking from the same watering hole. They
Right.
they it is not until the lion is engaging in a particular set of behaviors that the zebra then sees that says, oh, now I'm in danger. Now I'm going to run. Now I'm going to do something about it. Until that point, they don't have that same kind of anxiety that we have, where we see something that could potentially, possibly, maybe one day in the future sometimes happen,
Mhm.
even if it's a very low probability that it's going to happen. We start to build that anxiety around it, and that's that's where we again start getting into this other realm of things. But one of the last points that she makes in this section, under this step, is, and again it kind of goes to something we said in the last podcast. One of the things we need to do is think about developing skills for how we manage and think about our anxiety, rather
Right.
than focus on just, quote, getting better.
Exactly.
And I think that it's so important that we think about anxiety not as something that we need to cure, but something that we need to be able to regulate, something we need to be able to manage, just like our anger. You're never going to get rid of all of your anger, nor should you want to.
Right.
You need to get angry sometimes.
Right.
Anger is a perfectly responsible reaction to things sometimes. So is anxiety.
Right.
So instead of just trying to squash it, get better, get rid of it, find a cure for your anxiety, instead we need to figure out how to control it and how to manage it and how to learn from it so that we can then make better decisions.
Right. I think of all the things we've talked about in these part one and part two, I think this is probably the single most important part of this whole thing. Anxiety is not something, it's not a disease, it's not an illness. Sadly, it's listed as a mental illness, but it's not that kind of a mental illness. Okay.
But
And
it's a mental illness when it gets to that excessive,
that's right.
like if you're sitting around and you feel like you can't leave your house because you're afraid that a meteor is going to land on your home,
Right.
land on you when you're driving down the road. Okay, that is a level of worry and anxiety that is outside of the realm of typical, because the probability of that happening is so incredibly small,
Right.
but yet it's interfering with your ability to function. Okay, that is a mental health condition that we need to deal with. Uh,
But low level anxiety is not.
this typical thing that so many people experience, most people have a little bit of anxiety when they think about having to do a presentation in front of 100 strangers.
Right.
That's
Mhm.
not anxiety. That's not a mental illness. That is a normal anxious response to
Right.
an unfamiliar, situation that you're just not accustomed to.
Right.
That's all that
And so
is.
Yeah, this idea of getting better or curing or getting rid of or avoiding, doing what you can to avoid. When people come in here that I'm really anxious, what can I do? What they're asking for are these strategies, these little parlor tricks like breathing exercises and things to get rid of the anxiety. That's not what we're going to do. We are going to give you a more comprehensive approach. You have to develop skills. And the skills are not just these simple strategies that you see on when you Google anxiety. That's not what we're talking about. When we talk about developing skills, it's a whole approach. And one of them is dealing with your body. We talked about it in part one. So you have to, and this leads into, you have to use strategies, but the strategies have a very specific place to play in a more comprehensive approach.
Right.
Right? They're just, the strategies are part of, it's one of the 6 steps. It's not the only thing that we do. And we certainly don't want to give you strategies just so you can muffle the anxiety. That's not going to help you. What's going to be helpful is a comprehensive approach. Strategies are part of that, but they're only a part of it.
Right. Which leads to step 5, that is finding the strategy or technique that works for you so that
Right.
you can understand and you can learn from and hear your anxiety. You can cope with it in a way that doesn't, create dysfunction or major problems, but that you can then deal with whatever it is that caused it, whatever it is that the anxiety is communicating with you about. So things like deep breathing, meditation, yoga, there's a lot of art types of art-based activities that a person can do to help mediate and manage their anxiety. But
Mhm.
again, all with the idea of what is the anxiety trying to
That's
tell us?
right.
What are we trying to get to so that we can resolve that issue instead of just trying to, you know, cover it with a Band-Aid. We don't want to do
Right.
that.
That's right. Because when we talk about strategies, when people talk about strategies, well, look, one of the strategies is medication,
Right.
right? But strategies, including medications, are not meant to eradicate anxiety. And I think that's a huge fallacy that we just don't talk enough about.
Mhm.
Strategies, including medications, are not meant to eradicate. They're meant to reduce symptoms. It's like
Right.
ADHD. We give stimulant medication. It doesn't fix ADHD. It simply reduces the symptoms of ADHD so that parents and teachers can be more effective. It
Right.
doesn't cure you don't cure ADHD, you manage it. You don't cure anxiety, you manage it.
Mhm.
So these strategies are meant to reduce symptoms so that we can do all 6 of these steps effectively. Okay, so regardless of the strategy that you use, um, you have to find something, and this is the second part of strategies, that works for you. People say, oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to meditate. Meditates for liberals or meditates for tree huggers, or, I'm not going to meditate. You don't need to meditate. You don't have to use meditation. You can use whatever works for you. I don't want you to go home and drink a bottle of bourbon, but whatever strategy works for you is what we have to find. So you find a management technique. You find strategies that work for you. People say, well, I've tried medication, it doesn't work. That's fine. So medication doesn't work for you. Not everything is going to work for everybody. So what we do is we look for what works for you. I had a woman, I had a patient one time and years ago, and I knew what, well, let me put it this way. My mother was very a devout Catholic, and my mother would never meditate, but she
Mhm.
said the rosary every day.
Yeah.
Saying the rosary was her form of meditation. That's what
Absolutely.
she didn't realize. She didn't realize she was using meditation. She prayed, and that was her. That turns out that was meditation for her.
Right. Yeah, and I like when you threw in there, I don't want you to go home and drink a bottle of bourbon. Things like alcohol and all, it will decrease the symptoms. And so often we look for quick fixes. We're looking for the quick thing that I can do to make this feeling go away. And so alcohol is one of those things. But as we said in the last podcast, it doesn't fix the problem. And so what happens is it actually makes you more susceptible to the anxiety the next time. So,
That,
so you, instead of masking and covering it up and using strategies that are going to hurt you in the long run,
Mhm, mhm.
use strategies that are going to help increase your ability to cope with it. Um, yes, that oftentimes means that it takes a little bit longer. It's not going to have that immediate effect that alcohol might have.
Right.
In the long run, it's going to help you be able to cope with that anxiety in more settings, in more situations, and in a way that is just healthier for you overall. If you're anxious and you come home and you drink a bottle of bourbon and it fixes it, that's great. Well, the next day when you're at work and you start to feel anxious, you can't drink a bottle of bourbon to make that anxiety go away. Well, presumably you can't. So what are you going to do then? Well, you're going to be suffering with the anxiety. And so we have to find these healthy strategies that, like we said, work for you in a way that you can use it wherever you need to.
You know, as you were talking about that, it brought to mind how people today use cannabis, how people use marijuana. And you and I've had many discussions about this. It's a huge problem because people will say to us, well, I have to smoke weed in order to calm down. I have to smoke weed in order to sleep. When I get home after a hard day at work, I just sit back and I smoke some weed and then I feel better. That, I don't know whether weed causes anxiety or not. I know that alcohol and caffeine can increase anxiety. I don't know whether weed does or not, but I do know that weed is another way to avoid the anxiety. I mean, the problem with weed, let's take away the legal and medicinal and medical problem, however you want to look at it. The problem with weed is the same problem we have with alcohol and caffeine, is that you're using a substance to avoid. And one of the steps that we talked about was don't avoid anxiety.
Right.
But what weed does is it helps you to avoid your anxiety, and you never really deal with it. So you need to smoke every day because you're not dealing with the root cause. If you deal with the root cause, maybe you don't need to smoke weed. If you want to do it for recreational purposes, that's your decision.
Right.
But we're talking about for mental health reasons. Don't start relying on substances to avoid managing the causes of your anxiety. It's not going to get you where you want to go.
Absolutely. Now, her last step is nicely said, focus on berries and not bears.
Right.
When we started this out talking about how our body is always looking for, our brain is always looking for danger. It's always looking for negativity. And so this statement, focus on berries, not bears, kind of comes from our evolutionary background of, you're out foraging, looking for food and looking for berries. Now, in that bush over there, that bush contains the berries that we need to live. There
Right.
also could be a bear in that bush.
Mm-hmm.
If we're only thinking about the bear, we're going to starve to death.
Right. You're not going to go get your food.
You're
Right?
not going to go get your food. And so we have to think about some of those basic needs that we have, some of those, what we need to do to survive, instead of focusing on all the what ifs, what could possibly happen. There's much more likely, it is much more likely that there are berries on that bush and not a bear in the bush, right?
Chances are there are going to be more berries than bears.
Right. So
But
we have to look at that probability a little bit when we're trying to make decisions about things.
But it's also what you said about when anxiety becomes a mental illness. If you're so focused on your anxiety, if you're so focused on the bear that you don't eat, you're going to starve.
Right.
If you are so anxious that you don't leave your house, that's a problem. If
Right.
you stop eating, if you interfere with sleep, if you can't have relationships with other people, that's when you're too focused on the bear and you're going to miss the other things that you do need.
Right. So we have to, this as part of this last step that she mentions, we have to work to shift that focus. And we do that, through all the other steps that came before,
Right.
especially the one on finding the technique and strategy that works for you, that you can hear the anxiety, you can understand what it's trying to communicate, and then manage and cope with it so that you can then make good decisions. And part of those good decisions is to say, I need to go get that food. I need to do this, even though I'm a little bit anxious about it, even though my body is telling me to be cautious. I can be cautious and still do it.
That's right. Right. When we talk about, we talk about bears. Well, no, nobody wants to take a chance with a bear. But what we're using bear as sort of metaphor for you, a bear might be certain types of people. It might be a certain person. It might be your mother-in-law, or it might be a relative or a friend or a neighbor that you want to avoid.
Right.
So, what are the bears in your life?
Right.
Okay. One of the bears could be wanting to be perfect all the time.
Right.
That becomes a bear. That's your bear. And you have to stop thinking about the bear and
Right.
start thinking about the other things, irrational fears. That's your bear. So you have to stop thinking about the bear and start thinking about the other things that you should be doing. Just shift your focus a little bit to what you should be doing, because you're going to miss the berries if you're too focused.
Right. And I think in the same light, we all have different berries that we're going after, because,
Exactly.
berries is food and sustenance, but it's also, goals and things that you want to achieve in life, things that you
Yeah.
want to accomplish, places you want to go,
Right.
things you would like to do. And if we're again only focusing on those bears, we're not going to achieve and find the success that we want or the things that we want in life, because we're stopping ourselves, we're hindering ourselves through the anticipation and the anxiety about the bears.
How many times have you said, or you've heard other people say, well, I would really like to be a whatever,
Mhm. Right,
but I'm afraid that I can't.
right,
So you're
right,
giving up your dream because of your fear.
right,
And what everybody's advising is, no, no, no. Go after your dream. Focus on getting what you want
right,
instead of worrying about what might happen, what might, your fear or your need to be
right,
perfect. I can't do it. I'm afraid I can't do it, so I stay where I am.
right. Because if you're managing your anxiety the way that we're talking about it, what
Right.
you're going to do is you're going to go after those goals. You're going to go after those berries mindfully, in a way that says, I know that there could be some problems, but I'm going to be
Right.
ready for them. I have a plan. I
Right.
know that the anxiety is there to tell me something and to help me and work with me. I have a
Mhm.
plan for what I'm going to do when I'm there. I'm eating well. I'm sleeping. I'm exercising. And I'm going to choose a strategy that's going to work for me to help me manage it. If
Right.
you're doing those things, you're going to be able to go after those goals and just be mindful and be able to cope with that anxiety when it comes upon you.
Exactly. Right.
All
That's
right.
right.
Well, I think that's it for today on this two-part series on anxiety. Hopefully that's helpful for everyone. But obviously we're going to talk about anxiety lots
Right.
more
Right.
at different times in the future. But until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.